Good morning, everyone. So my name is Alexis Kirk, and I am proud to admit that I am the Blue Devil. So if there are any other Duke fans in the house, so I'll be leading the first portion of the HIS training today. And before we dive into the content for this session, I wanted to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. So just as a reminder, you can submit your questions through the online portal or using the cards, and we will be holding live questions until the end of the second session after lunch today. Second, if you haven't already, we highly recommend that you download and review the new version of the manual that's up on the CMS website. It contains a lot of good information beyond what's in the training here today, including detailed coding instructions for all of the new items, as well as lots of clinical coding examples. And I do want to make one note. We are planning on posting an updated version of the manual, hopefully sometime this week. And that's just going to contain a small correction to Appendix D. So if you've already printed the version of the manual that's up now, you don't need to reprint the whole thing. You can just swap out Appendix D. Finally, I wanted to note that in addition to using the polling questions that you've already had a couple of today, this session is going to use a case study. We're going to have 2 of them, and I'll provide some more instruction about the case study once we get to our first set of questions there. So this portion of the training today is really going to focus on what's new to the HIS. So we're going to talk about the new items that were added to the admission record. There's 3 of those. We're also going to talk about the new items that were added to the HIS-Discharge record, and there are 4 of those. In addition, we're going to cover both of the 2 new measures that both Stacy and Brenda mentioned earlier. And since the titles are pretty long, we're going to refer to those measures by the Hospice Composite measure. That's how we'll be referring to that one. And then we'll refer to the visits measure as the visits measure pair. The last thing I want to point out here on slide 2 is just that all of the content we'll cover in this session today, so both the new items and the new measures, they all go into effect April 1st of this year. So we'll start out with the 3 new items that were added to the HIS admission record, and they're listed here on slide 3. I'd like to emphasize that none of these 3 items is used in any quality measure calculation. So the 2 new items that were added to Section A are going to be used for patient identification and record matching. And then the new item that was added to Section J, pain, is really just a helper item to improve the flow of the current existing items in that section. Let's take a closer look at each of these 3 items. The first is item A0550, and this is the patient zip code item. So this item is going to be found on the HIS admission record in Section A, and I want to point out that this will collect the patient's zip code, not the zip code of your hospice or your facility. So item A0550 is intended to capture the zip code where the patient resides while receiving hospice services, even if this is not the patient's usual or legal address. And we're going to use the zip code data from this item on the Hospice Compare website to determine locations where your hospice provided services. When you complete item A0550, you're going to start with the leftmost box. So at a minimum, you should enter the 5-digit zip code. And if you're entering only the 5-digit zip code, that means that last set of boxes will be blank. If it's available to you, you can also enter the extended zip code. And if you're using the extended zip code, then you will fill all of the boxes for this item. So On slide 6, we present some tips for item A0550. And tips are really intended to be helpful hints to you that are going to provide clarifications, issues of note, or conditions to be considered as you're completing items. So you'll notice throughout this portion of the presentation we have several tips, and these tips are also included in the HIS manual. So here on slide 6, we've included 4 situations about zip code to address in the training today. The first situation that we think might be common is one where the hospice patient's permanent address is in one city, but that patient is receiving hospice services in another city. So this could be a situation where the hospice patient permanently resides in city A, but they've decided to receive hospice services, say, at their daughter's home, and the daughter lives in city B. So for item A0550, remember we're always looking for the zip code where the patient is receiving hospice services. So in this example, you would list the zip code for city B, the daughter's home. In the second situation that we think might be common, patients may receive hospice services in a facility other than their home. So this could be a nursing facility, assisted living facility, or an inpatient hospice. Again, in this situation, you would enter the zip code where the patient is actually receiving the services. So this would be the zip code for that facility. The third situation is one where a hospice patient is admitted and initially is receiving services in a GIP facility, but they plan to move home at a future date. In this situation, you would enter the zip code for the GIP facility, since that is where they are receiving services initially. The final situation that we think might be common is one where the hospice has made the first visit to the patient in the hospital, but the patient was then discharged to home and is going to receive hospice services at home. In this situation, you would enter the zip code for the patient's home. The second new item on the HIS admission record is A1400, the payer information item. So as you can see here on the slide, this item is a check-all that apply format. So you'll fill in all of the payer sources that a patient has. A1400 is intended to reflect all current existing payer sources regardless of whether that payer is expected or likely to provide reimbursement. So for example, say a Medicare beneficiary was a Medicare Advantage patient prior to electing the hospice benefit. When completing item A1400, you would still select the response option for Medicare Advantage, which is response option B, even though Medicare Advantage may not reimburse the hospice directly for any services. So although item A1400 is intended to reflect all current existing payer sources, pending pay sources should not be included in this item. So say, for example, the patient has applied for Medicaid, but that Medicaid status is pending, you would not check the box for Medicaid for item A1400. So on the next slide, we have some tips for item A1400. And the first tip is about our recommended process for completing this item. We recommend that you try and validate pay sources as possible. So for example, if a patient is a Medicare beneficiary, you could ask for them to present their Medicare card so you can validate that pay source. That being said, you can complete item A1400 based on patient or caregiver report. So although we think many of the response options for the pay sources listed in A1400 are self-explanatory, We have listed on this slide and in the HIS manual some definitions to help clarify the difference between response options J, K, X, and Y. You should select response J, self-pay, if the patient has available any amount of personal funds to contribute to their care. You should select response K, no payer source, if you have confirmed that the patient does not have any pay sources available. You should select response X, unknown, only if you are unable to confirm the existence of any of the pay sources listed in A1400. And finally, you would select response Y, other, if the patient has one or more pay sources beyond those listed in A1400. So the third and final item that was added to the HIS admission record is item J0905. And this item was added to section J, pain, and collects information on whether or not pain is an active problem for the patient. So before I go into details about how to complete this item, I wanted to provide a little bit of history and context as to why we added this item to this version of the HIS. So you may remember in the original version of the HIS, Section J, pain, had two items. There was J0900, the pain screening item, and J0910, the comprehensive pain assessment item. So in that original version of the HIS, you only completed the comprehensive pain assessment item if the patient had pain at the time of the screening visit. And based on some input that we've received over the help desk from the provider community this past couple of years, we added J0905 as what we call a helper item to improve the flow between those two existing items. So J0905 is going to appear in between that original pain screening item and the comprehensive pain assessment item. And we think that the addition of J0905 helps align the existing pain items with clinical practice. Now, instead of completing the comprehensive pain assessment item based solely on the patient's pain severity at the time of that screening visit, you'll complete the comprehensive pain assessment item based on how you respond to this new item, J0905, whether or not pain is an active problem for the patient. This means that the HIS now directs providers to complete the comprehensive pain assessment item on a wider range of patients, including those who don't have pain at the time of the visit, but for whom pain is an active problem. Currently, J0905 is just a helper item in this section. So that means that we are not using J0905 at this time in the calculation of any of the pain quality measures. As we analyze the data from J0905 once it's implemented in April, we may consider using this item for future measure calculations. There we go. So in determining whether or not pain is an active problem for the patient, you should consider factors beyond pain severity at the time of the clinical encounter. So this may include things like asking the patient for a historical report of pain, so what their pain has been like, say, over the last 2 days, or reviewing order lists to see if the patient is currently receiving any treatment for pain, whether that be a pharmacologic or non-pharmacologic intervention. So based on the review of these other factors, it is possible that the clinician may determine pain is an active problem for the patient, even if pain is not present during the clinical encounter. Generally, clinical documentation that the patient is currently taking pain medication is evidence that pain is an active problem for the patient. So on slide 13, we have our first polling scenario for this portion of the training. So this situation, the hospice nurse has asked the patient to rate their pain on a numeric scale of 0 to 10. The patient denied any pain during that visit and stated that it was not an issue for him at all. However, in reviewing the medications, the nurse confirmed with the wife that he is taking long-acting oxycodone as ordered twice per day. So based on the information that's presented here, how would you respond to the new pain active problem item? Oh. So you can enter your responses using the polling devices at your table. Great. So the vast majority of everyone has answered yes, which is the correct answer for this polling scenario. So remember, whether a patient is experiencing any level of pain at the time of the visit is only one factor in determining whether or not pain is an active problem. So even though this patient denied having any pain when the nurse asked him about it at the visit, the nurse considered factors beyond that current pain severity score. And the fact that the patient was currently taking a long-acting opioid for pain is sufficient evidence that pain is an active problem. Okay. So now that we've gone over the 3 new items that were added to the HIS admission record, we're going to move on to the next portion of this session in the training, which is really going to focus on those 2 new quality measures. So I'm going to start with the hospice composite measure first. Sorry, I don't know why I'm having so many problems with this clicker. There we go. So before we delve into the details of the hospice composite measure, I want to provide a high-level explanation of what a composite measure is in general, since it may be a different type of measure than other measures that you're familiar with. So up to this point in the HQRP, all of those 7 original HIS measures that we've talked about in earlier presentations today, all of those measures were really focused on a single care process. So they captured things like, was the patient screened for pain? Or did the hospice discuss patient preferences? And the hospice composite measure is different from these single care process measures in that it will capture whether multiple care processes were delivered in a single metric. So instead of asking, did you do X, a composite measure asks, did you do X, Y, and Z? In the hospice composite measure, it's important to note that there's no partial credit. So you must complete all applicable parts of the measure to get credit for this measure. So this means if your hospice did X and Y, but not Z, in our composite measure, you would not get credit. In general, the goal of this hospice composite measure is to assess whether a comprehensive assessment was completed at the time of hospice admission. It does so by evaluating whether or not those 7 individual care processes were completed for each patient's stay as applicable. The 7 individual care processes captured by the composite measure are those original 7 NQF-endorsed quality measures previously implemented in the HQRP. So in composite measure jargon, we refer to those individual measures as component measures. 2 final important notes about the composite measure before we move on. The composite measure will be calculated using those 7 existing measures. So this means that there is no new data collection required on your part for the composite measure. Second, patient admissions occurring on or after April 1st will be included in the calculation of the measure. So here on slide 18, you can see listed out the 7 care processes that are captured by the composite measure. And hopefully all of these measures look familiar to you, since they are the 7 measures that were originally implemented with the HIS back in July of 2014. On slide 19, we have a note about how NQF endorsement is going to impact a specific component of the composite measure. So all 7 of the component measures used to calculate the composite measure are endorsed by the National Quality Forum, or NQF. The NQF was established to standardize healthcare quality measurement and reporting through its consensus measure development process. So recently, in October of 2016, all 7 component measures underwent their maintenance endorsement review, and they received re-endorsement by NQF. During this maintenance review, the 7-day length of exclusion for each of the individual measures was retired, and it will no longer be used in the calculation of the individual quality measures. So since the composite measure is calculated using the data from those individual quality measures, this means that the composite measure will not have a length of stay exclusion either. So now that we've gone over some general information about what the hospice composite measure is, I wanted to share our motivation for creating the composite measure in the first place. Specifically, how it will provide useful information beyond what each of the individual quality measures could provide on their own. So first, since the composite measure looks at whether or not a hospice completed a bundle of care processes, it may provide more actionable data to consumers. So if we think about a consumer eventually looking on the Hospice Compare website to review quality of care performance for individual hospice agencies, instead of having to look at 7 individual measures and think, okay, did this hospice do X? Did this hospice do Y? Did this hospice do Z? What the composite measure will do is allow consumers to see at a glance whether or not the hospice completed that entire bundle of care processes. For providers, we hope that the composite measure sets a higher standard of care since there's no partial credit for our composite measure. So we hope that this measure as such incentivizes providers to complete all components of the measure as applicable to receive credit. Slide 21 lists the numerator and the denominator for this new composite measure. The denominator for this measure includes all patient stays, except for those that meet the denominator exclusion criteria, which I'll discuss on the next slide. The numerator for the measure includes all patient stays from the denominator who meet the numerator criteria for each of the individual component measures for which the patient is eligible. So you've heard me now say a couple of times either the phrase as applicable or for which the patient is eligible. And I keep on using that phrase because I want to signal that 3 of those 7 individual quality measures are what we call conditional measures. And I'm going to go over in detail what a conditional measure is and how it gets treated in the composite measure in a coming slide. So next, we're going to talk about the denominator exclusions for the measure. So to be included in the denominator for the composite measure, 3 conditions must be met. First, the patient cannot be under 18. Second, the patient must have been discharged from the hospice as determined by the submission of the HIS-Discharge record. And third, the discharged patient must have a matching HIS admission record. So what this means is that patients under 18, active stays, and patients missing an admission record are excluded from the denominator of this measure. I'd also like to note that at this time, the composite measure is not risk adjusted or stratified. So earlier I mentioned those conditional measures, and here's where I'm going to explain in more detail what those conditional measures are and how they're treated in the composite measure. So 3 of the 7 component measures, and I'm sorry, I know it's a lot of C words, component, composite, and conditional, so try and bear with me. So 3 of the 7 component measures are conditional measures. The 3 conditional measures are 1637, the pain assessment quality measure, 1638, the dyspnea treatment measure, and 1617, the bowel regimen measure. And a conditional measure is just one where only a subset of patients are included in the measure denominator. As such, the measure is dependent or conditional on some other factor. So I'll explain that in the context of an example. So for a patient to be included in the denominator for the 1638 dyspnea treatment measure, that patient first needs to screen positive for dyspnea or shortness of breath. Thus, the treatment measure is conditional on screening positive for shortness of breath first. So I wanted to point these conditional measures out because they get special treatment in the composite quality measure. So in the individual measure, patients are left out of the measure entirely if they don't meet that condition. So if a patient doesn't screen positive for shortness of breath, in the calculation of the individual measure, they're left out of that treatment measure entirely. So in the composite measure, it's a little different. If a patient is not eligible for one of the conditional quality measures, they're treated as if they are, and the hospice gets credit for completing that care process anyway. Again, I'll talk about that in the context of an example. So going back to our dyspnea measures, if a patient screens negative for shortness of breath, that patient would not be eligible for the individual dyspnea treatment measure. And although that patient is not eligible for the individual quality measure, for the composite quality measure, we're going to assume they were, and we're going to give the hospice credit for initiating treatment anyway. And this may seem a bit strange to you at first, giving a hospice credit for something that they didn't actually do, but if we think about it clinically, hopefully it'll make more sense to you. So in this case, doing nothing or not initiating treatment is the correct clinical step to take, since you really only want to initiate treatment if a patient actually has a symptom. So one way to think about this for the composite measure is that we're giving credit to hospices for inaction when inaction is the right step to take for those conditional measures. So now we've arrived at our first portion of this session that's going to be using case study, the case study 1. So all of the case study materials are available to you in your folders if you're attending in person, and they're available to you in the zip folder if you're an online participant. So for right now, what I'd like everyone to do is just get out case study number 1 and just read through the example and the clinical documentation that's provided for that case study. So for right now, we're not going to answer any questions associated with the case study. We just want to give you all a few minutes to read over it, familiarize yourself with the content, and it may be helpful to underline things or highlight them or take notes in the margin, because we will be answering some questions throughout the rest of this session based on the information provided in case study number 1. So I'll give everybody a few minutes to read over that case study now, and then we'll resume the presentation. So I see a good number of people looking up, so hopefully most of you have had the opportunity to review the information provided in case study 1. If you didn't get all the way through it, we are going to be coming back to the information provided there so you can review it as we go through answering some of the questions throughout the rest of this session. So I want to turn now and review each of the individual component measures that constitute the composite measure. So remember, the composite measure is made up of all of those 7 original HIS measures and items, and we're going to review each of those 7 measures and their associated items now. So many of these slides will probably look familiar to you, since they're the same items that were on version 1 of the HIS and the same items that you've been using since July of 2014. We're going to start our review with section F, which focuses on preferences. The items in section F pertain to preferences regarding treatment and spiritual and existential concerns. The first 3 items in section F are used to calculate NQF 1641, the treatment preferences quality measure. F3000 is used to calculate NQF 1647, the spiritual and existential concerns measure. So all of the items in section F are intended to capture the process of eliciting or attempting to elicit patient preferences. So thus in these items, when we say we're looking for evidence of a discussion, what we're looking for is evidence that the hospice opened the door for a conversation about life-sustaining treatments or about spiritual care. The conversation does not have to result in initiation of interventions, nor does it have to result in the patient stating a preference for or against a certain treatment in order to count for the measure. So before we delve into each of the individual items, we're going to look at some overarching tips for section F in general. So here on slide 28, you can see the general structure of all of the section F items, which are intended to capture whether a discussion occurred, did not occur, or whether a discussion was offered but it was declined. This last option is going to apply to situations where the hospice was unable to successfully engage the patient and/or caregiver, and there is an explicit refusal from the patient or caregiver to discuss preferences. And we'll see some examples of what a patient or caregiver refusal might look like later on. If there have been multiple discussions about life-sustaining treatment or spiritual and existential concerns, you should complete the items in section F based on the first discussion that appears in the record. So for the items in this section, it is permissible to consider discussions that took place prior to admission, so during pre-admission or educational visits. And I'll go over some more specific guidance on that on the next slide. So for the purposes of the quality measures, discussions count if they occur no more than 7 days prior to admission or within 5 days of admission. Discussion should take place with the patient or caregiver or responsible party if the patient cannot self-report. And discussions may be initiated by any member of the hospice staff or interdisciplinary group. So the first item in section F is F2000, which looks at CPR preferences. Slide 32 has a few tips related to item F2000. So since what we're looking for in all of these items is really evidence of a discussion, orders alone or short statements in the clinical record, such as DNR or full code, are not sufficient evidence to select yes for F2000A. One common data source for Section F items may be a POLST or other equivalent form. If a patient is admitted to your hospice with a pre-existing DNR or POLST that was signed in a prior care setting, the hospice must attempt to reaffirm the patient's preferences via a discussion in order to answer yes for F2000A. The next item in the section is F2100. So for this item, you're looking for documentation of a discussion about preferences for life-sustaining treatments other than CPR. As with the other Section F items, the intent of this question is to ask about whether the hospice opened the door for a conversation. So that conversation does not have to result in a clear preference for or against a particular life-sustaining treatment for it to count for the measure. It's important to note that there is no single comprehensive list of other life-sustaining treatments. So documentation that your hospice asked about any life-sustaining treatment, and that could be any variety of things such as ventilator support, tube feeding, dialysis, or blood transfusions, is sufficient to code one of the yes options. The next item in Section F is F2200, and for this item, you're looking for evidence of a discussion about hospitalization. So we get a lot of questions on the help desk about this item, and what we hear from providers most often is how do we define hospitalization for the purposes of this item in the measure? So for F2200, hospitalization does not refer to the patient's choice of a particular facility, but rather if the hospice opened the door for a conversation about hospitalization as a care option to consider. So what might a discussion about hospitalization look like? We've provided some examples here on slide 38. So first, a discussion may be the case where a patient expresses a desire to be kept at home instead of being transferred to a hospital. In the second situation, a patient could express specific instances or conditions under which they would go to the hospital to receive care. And in the final situation, remember that a discussion does not have to result in the patient stating a clear preference about their hospitalization needs. So if they state things like they're unsure at this time whether or not they'd like to go to the hospital, remember, this is sufficient evidence since it would note that the hospice opened the door for a conversation. Now we've arrived at our second polling scenario for this portion of the training today, and it relates to the hospitalization item. So in this situation, there's a note from both the nurse and the social worker about attempting to discuss hospitalization with the patient. In both cases, the patient made statements like, "I'm just glad to be home and want to focus on my family," or "I'm taking it one day at a time right now." So based on the documentation provided here, how would you respond to F22A, the hospitalization item? Okay, So it looks like everyone has had a chance to submit their answers, and it looks like most people listed answer choice B, but answer choice C is actually the correct answer. So I'll go over some greater explanation about this question now. So in this scenario, it's evident that 2 people from the hospice team attempted to bring up this issue with the patient. So from there, we can narrow it down, and it looks like you guys did this as well. So we know that we want either response B or C, which is one of those yes options. So now we just have to figure out which yes option is most appropriate in this situation. So here, option C is better than option B because although the patient did it in a very polite way, it was clear that the patient was putting off discussing this topic and that they really weren't ready for discussion yet. Thus, C, refuse to discuss, is the best answer here. And I want to just also note that whether you answer B or C, so yes, a discussion occurred, or yes, but the patient responsible party refused to discuss, both of those count for the numerator criteria for the measure. The final item in section F is F3000, which asks about discussion of spiritual or existential concerns. And this item is used in the calculation of the second preferences measure, 1647. So one thing that you may notice that's slightly different about this item is the wording. So this item is asking whether or not a discussion took place with the patient or caregiver. So for item F3000, the caregiver does not have to be the legally authorized representative. And this is in contrast to those first 3 items we discussed, where you are to ask the legally responsible party about preferences for treatment if the patient is unable to self-report. So again, as with all of the other section F items, this item is also intended to capture whether the hospice opened the door for a conversation. So you do not have to initiate any interventions for the purposes of the quality measure here. There is no comprehensive list of spiritual or existential concerns. So it's left to the judgment of the hospice staff providing care for the patient and family to decide what they think would be best to discuss with the patient or caregiver. Some examples of what a discussion might look like are listed here and may include things like asking about need for spiritual or religious support, or asking questions about the cause or meaning of illness or death. The most important takeaway from slide 44 is that clinical record documentation that shows only the patient's religious affiliation, so for example, noting that the patient is Baptist, is not sufficient to answer yes to F3000A. And that's because, again, we're looking for evidence of a discussion. So with the conclusion of our review of section F, we have arrived at our first set of questions for case study 1. So if you would, take a few minutes at your table and you can pull back out that case study document that you reviewed earlier, and you'll also want to get out the excerpt from the HIS admission that was provided to you in your packets. So what I would like for everyone to do now is you can work in small groups at your table and go through the case study and complete all of the items in section F. So just work on the section F items for now, which would be F2000 through F3000. So we'll give you a few minutes to work on that, and we are going to have some of my wonderful colleagues circulating the room. So if you hit a stumbling block or confused about anything, they'll be walking around and can help you out. Okay, so hopefully most of you have had the opportunity to go through the case study and look at the items in section F. So I think for now we will resume and we're going to go over the correct coding for the items in section F. And before we do that, I wanted to clarify one thing about the last polling question we did. So the example where the patient was asked about their hospitalization preferences, in that scenario, the correct answer was C, but I just wanted to reiterate that even in the case of a refusal, the first part of that answer is still yes. So you get a yes because the hospice opened the door for a conversation, even in instances where the patient refused. So why don't we start by taking a look at the first item, which is F2000 A and B. So I'm just going to try having everybody in the room shout out their answers, and we'll see how that goes. So what did everybody list for F2000A? Yeah. Yes. Okay. And what about the date for F2000B? The 13th. Okay, so let's take a look. So we said yes for A and the 13th for B. So let's look and see how we did. So both of those are correct. So here with the documentation for F2000A, we see a note on the 13th where the hospice liaison discussed with Mr. J some of his preferences, and Mr. J was very clear about his wishes not to be resuscitated. So it's that note in the documentation that clued us in to what the correct answer was for item F2000. And remember what we're looking for, although in this instance Mr. J happened to have a preference and stated he did not want to be resuscitated, what we're really looking for this item in the measure is that evidence of a discussion, and that is here in this case. So what about F2100? What did everybody put for part A? Yes. Okay. And what about the date for part B? The 13th. Okay. So let's see how we did there. Great. So in this scenario, again, the correct answer for F2100A is yes, and the date to list there is November 13th. So here in the case study, we see a note that talks a little bit more about Mr. J's preferences. And again, he talks about not wanting to have CPR, which we've already covered in F2000, but he also states that he does not want any other life supports and that he would like to be kept comfortable. So this is really the documentation that you would use to complete item F2100. Next up is hospitalization. What did people list for F2200A? Yes, okay. And what about the date here? 13th, okay. And that is correct, great job. So here, the logic behind this response comes from that RN note on the 13th, and it states that Mr. J prefers to remain at home, but he's clear that he does not want to become a burden to his family and would return to the hospital only if his symptoms cannot be controlled or it becomes too difficult for his wife and daughters at home. So that was the passage related to item F2200. The final item is F3000A. What did you all list here for part A? Yes, okay. And what about the date here? Okay. Okay, so we have a variety. I've heard the 13th, the 15th, and the 16th. So the correct answer here is yes, so sounds like we did well on part A. And then the date for part B here is going to be the 15th. So if we want to flip to the 15th in the case study, I can point out the documentation from that date that led us to this answer. So on the 15th, the hospice RN noted that Mr. J stated he is not interested in seeking chaplain support and that he has a local priest who is a friend of the family who plans to visit during the next week. This meets the requirements of F3000 because this statement provides evidence that the door was open for a conversation and that Mr. J was able to state his preferences for spiritual care. So remember, this item is about capturing the conversation, not capturing whether any subsequent services were provided. So even though Mr. J declined a visit from the hospice's chaplain, the hospice can still answer yes, since it was clear that a discussion took place about spiritual and existential concerns. So with that, we're going to move on to section J, and here we're going to talk about the items related to pain. So the two items listed on this slide, J0900 and J0910, are the two items used to calculate the corresponding pain quality measures, which are the 1634 pain screening measure and the 1637 pain assessment measure. So I brought up the topic of conditional measures earlier in the presentation. And here we've arrived at our first conditional measure, which is 1637, that pain assessment measure. And it's conditional because you will only complete the pain assessment item and you will only be included in the denominator of the measure if the patient screens positive for pain. The first item in this section is J0900, which is the pain screening item. And again, this item is used to calculate the corresponding pain screening quality measure. So this item has 4 parts. Part A asks whether or not the patient was screened for pain. Part B is where you record the date of that pain screening. And the final 2 parts of the item are C and D. Part C captures the pain severity at the time of the screen, and Part D captures which standardized tool was used. So for the pain screening quality measure, if the patient has pain, you must rate its severity, and you must do that using a standardized tool to get credit for the measure. So that's why we've included Part C and D in the item. So on the prior slide, I mentioned that a screening has 2 parts. You first have to determine if pain is present, and if pain is present, you have to rate its severity using a standardized tool. So asking a patient about their pain comfort may be a good way to determine whether or not pain is present. Again, if pain is present, it should be rated using a standardized tool. And the HIS manual provides some examples of different types of standardized tools that fit into each category for Part D. And the most important takeaway from slide 58 that I'd like for everyone to take note of is how to handle a situation where a patient reports a range of severity scores. So this may happen if the patient is asked about pain and the patient says something like, well, I'd say my pain is between a mild and a moderate right now. Or they may state something like, well, the pain in my foot is a 5, but the pain in my abdomen is a 7. So in this instance, the patient has listed multiple severities. If during the time of screening, the patient provides a range of severities, the highest level of severity experienced during the visit is what you should record for item J0900. So the next item here on slide 59 is the pain active problem. And you may be wondering right now, why is this item appearing here in the review of the individual component measures? Because you said earlier it's not used in the calculation of the measures. That's right. So we wanted to include this item here just as a little reminder to show you how the new version of the HIS is going to look. So you're going to start out with the pain screening item, pain active problem will follow, and then you'll go to comprehensive pain assessment in version 2 of the HIS. But if you were thinking that, you are right, and that this item is not used in the calculation of any of the quality measures right now. The final item in the pain section is J0910, and this is the comprehensive pain assessment item that's used to calculate NQF 1637, the corresponding pain assessment quality measure. As reflected in the bullet on this slide, this item and the associated quality measure are one of the conditional quality measures, like I mentioned earlier. So it looks at whether or not a patient received a comprehensive pain assessment if they screened positive for pain. Slide 62 lists some tips for this item. First, a comprehensive pain assessment is more thorough than a pain screening, and should address multiple aspects of the patient's experience of pain beyond just a rating of severity. So Part C of item J0910 is where you note what was included in the pain assessment. And there are 7 characteristics to choose from in Part C, and Part C is a check all that apply format. To check off one of the elements in Part C, the clinician must have made an attempt to gather the information from the patient or caregiver. So this means if you ask a patient about what makes their pain better or worse, and they state, I'm not really sure, you can still check off what makes pain better or worse in Part C, since the clinician made an attempt to gather that information. For Part C, caregiver report of pain characteristics is also an acceptable source of information. So the last thing I want to note here is about a question that we get a lot on the help desk, which is how to complete the comprehensive pain assessment for nonverbal patients. So comprehensive pain assessment of nonverbal patients is possible, and the HIS manual provides some more details about pain assessment for nonverbal patients and what that might look like. In short, for these patients, you may need to use other strategies to assess pain, such as looking for behavioral indicators of pain or asking the caregiver to report patient behavior that may be indicative of pain. So in order to receive credit for the pain assessment quality measure, the assessment must be completed within 1 day of the positive pain screening, and a minimum of 5 of the 7 pain characteristics must be assessed. The requirement of 5 out of 7 and having that assessment be conducted within 1 day of the screening are criteria that apply to both the individual quality measure and the composite quality measure. With that, we've arrived at our next set of questions for the case study. So if you'll again take some time at your table to walk through the pain items now, and you can review the case study and answer the questions in section J that relate to pain, and then we'll go over them as a group in just a few minutes. Okay, so we're going to resume now with our debrief for the section J pain items. So let's look first at item J0900, which is the pain screening item. So what did you all list for J0900A was the patient screen for pain? Okay. And what about Part B for the date? The 15th, great. And what about Part C, the score, the severity score? 2, moderate, okay. And finally, Part D, what type of pain tool was used? Numeric. Okay, so let's see how we did. So it looks like we are great students today and got all of the portions of J0900 correct. So I'll walk through some of the rationale for this now. So this is all based on the clinical record documentation from November 15th, which clearly shows that Mr. J was screened for pain since severity was assessed using a standardized tool. Let's look now at Part C and D specifically, the severity and the type of tool. Mr. J stated his pain was a 6 on a numeric scale of 0 to 10. So as stated in the HIS manual, a score of 6 on a numeric scale would correlate to moderate, so we select moderate for J0900C. Since a 0 to 10 scale was used, we select numeric for J0900D. And although the documentation from the 15th shows that Mr. J was clearly asked about other aspects of his pain, we're only focused on the severity and type of tool right now, since that's what we need for the pain screening item. So what about J0905? How did you respond to that one? Yes or no? Great. So in this case, Mr. J stated he had pain during the visit, so that's pretty clear evidence that pain is an active problem for him. So what about J0910A? Yes, okay. And what about J0910B, the date of the comprehensive pain assessment? The 15th, okay. So let's look at those. So all of that is correct. So we've gone through the pain active problem. He said he had pain during the visit, so that's evidence that pain is an active problem for Mr. J. And for J0910A, you would enter yes, since other elements beyond severity were assessed. Or I should say, since at least one element of Part C was assessed. So for J0910B, again, the correct date to enter is the 15th. So we do see that a more thorough pain assessment was conducted on the 18th, but as stated in the HIS manual, you should complete J0910 based on the first dated pain assessment, which was on the 15th. So what about J0910C? I'll just call these out one by one, and you guys can just reply yes or no. So what about location? Okay. Severity, character, duration, okay. Frequency, no. And relieves or worsens pain, effect on function or quality of life. Okay, sounds like we had a mix of responses there. And what about 9? None of the above. Okay. So here we can see that we would end up checking off 4 out of 7. And those 4 are location, severity, character, and what relieves or worsens pain. So we check off location because Mr. J stated that the right side of his abdomen was in pain. We check off severity using that same 6 out of 10 rating that we use for the pain screening item. We check off character based on his description that the pain was tight and he had a bloating feeling and pressure from within. And we check off what relieves or worsens pain based on Mr. J reporting that pain was worse while lying flat. So although we didn't check off duration, frequency, and effect on function or quality of life, I'll go over what those might look like for a different patient. So an assessment for duration would have included information about how long the pain lasts. An assessment of frequency would have included information about how often the pain occurs. An assessment on function or quality of life would have included information about impact on a patient's activity or movement, such as the patient cannot sleep comfortably through the night, or the patient is no longer able to sit up in bed due to their pain. So although there was the note that Mr. J was no longer able to get out of bed, this note is indicative of Mr. J's function. He's no longer able to get out of bed, but the clinical record documentation shows that this functional limitation was due to general weakness, not specifically his pain. So that's why we didn't check that off. Yep, that's correct. So that concludes this portion of the training. And I see we have about 1 minute left in the session. So at this time, we'll see if maybe we can answer maybe 1 or 2 questions you might have about any of the content that I presented.
For Medicaid pending, so in the new, we're not going to include that at all, so the plus sign in that data space is going to be null and void?
So that's a great question. So the question was about Medicaid pending. So in the original version of the HIS, and this item will remain on the new version of the HIS, there is an item that's specifically about Medicaid number. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it's A0600. So on that one, you do still enter the plus if the Medicaid number is pending. That instruction that I gave during the training today was specific to A01400, which is the new payer checklist item. So you're right, you've pointed out that how you treat pending status for Medicaid specifically will differ now between that original Medicaid item where you enter the plus for pending and the new payer item where you won't check it off in the checklist if it's pending.
So it'll look, if there is Medicaid pending, it'll look like yes in one place and no in another place. Okay.
Correct.
Can I ask a second question? You talked about the composite measure not being, it will be included in the quality reporting. So the quality reporting is going to look different than what we all saw in December, correct? Is it just going to be the composite measure, or is it still going to be those 7 treatment NQF
There will be
measures?
both. That's a great question. So the question was, is the composite measure essentially going to replace the individual 7, or will there be both? Our current plan is to still use both. So we'll have the composite measure score, and then we'll also still have and calculate and report out the individual QMs. And that's because we think while the composite measure is great in that it provides a quick snapshot of what a hospice did, we still want to be able to have providers and consumers drill down to those 7 individual care processes that might be important to them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I have one question. For the comprehensive pain assessment, we had 4 different things that were marked as far as the type of assessment that we did. From my understanding, there is a minimum of 5 that have to be.
That's correct, and I didn't state that. So in this example, we only checked off 4, and that means that this hospice would not get credit for the pain assessment quality measure. So you have to complete at least 5 per the measure specifications in order to get credit. So in this particular example, the hospice would not get credit for the individual component measure, and in the new composite measure, it wouldn't count for that measure either.
So we're going to dive back into section J. So we left off before lunch where Alexis had finished talking about the pain items. We're going to move now into the respiratory status items of the HIS. So section J, like I said, has items in here to collect data about screening and treatment for shortness of breath. And the items J2030 and 2040 are used to calculate 2 NQF measures. The first one is NQF 1639, which is the dyspnea screening measure, and its conditional measure, which is the NQF 1638 measure, or the dyspnea treatment measure. So again, here, this is a set of a conditional measure. So the treatment measure is the conditional measure. That means that when you are completing the HIS, if a patient did not screen positive for shortness of breath, you would not complete the treatment items. There are skip patterns within the HIS that will occur because of this. So here you see the screenshot for the first item, J2030. And this first item asks about whether the patient was screened for shortness of breath and the date. It also asks if the patient was screened for shortness of breath and whether that screening indicated that the patient was experiencing shortness of breath or whether shortness of breath was an active problem for that patient. So when you're completing J2030, you would review the first documented screening for shortness of breath that appears in the clinical record. You might find more than one screening for shortness of breath. It could even occur on every visit, but the one we're interested in for the HIS is the first screening. So a screening for shortness of breath is defined in the HIS manual as evaluating for the presence or the absence of a symptom, and if it's present, rating its severity. And the assessment of severity for dyspnea can be done in any manner that's clinically appropriate for the patient. That might include using a standardized assessment tool for dyspnea. And then if you find sufficient evidence that a screening took place, you would then code yes on the item J2030. So the next item is J2040, which is asking about treatment for shortness of breath. This item is asking about three things: whether treatment for shortness of breath was initiated, when it was initiated, and what types of treatment were initiated, and that includes medication as well as non-medication treatments. So when you're completing J2040, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, and we have some tips here for you. First, there are some treatments that have multiple uses. So for example, medications such as opioids can be used to treat shortness of breath, but they might also be used to treat pain. And so for treatments where there are multiple uses, the clinical record must indicate that that medication or treatment is being used to treat shortness of breath for you to count it as a treatment in the item J2040. Okay? Secondly, when you're listing the date the treatment was initiated in the HIS is defined as the date on which the hospice received the order to begin treatment. Okay, so it's not the date that you delivered the first dose, it's the date you got the order. Hopefully that is probably the same day. Finally, you might also find that multiple treatments for shortness of breath were initiated. So, you may educate the patient about positioning or energy conservation in addition to prescribing medication. So you are looking for the date here that the first treatment was initiated, okay, for answering item J2040. The final tip for this item is regarding comfort kits or standing orders or pre-printed admission orders. So pre-printed admission orders or comfort kits alone are not sufficient to count it as treatment initiated for shortness of breath, right? To be counted as a treatment initiated, there has to be documentation that the hospice received the order and instructed the patient or family to use the medication or the treatment. Okay, so you guys remember your case study from before lunch. We're going to turn back to that at your tables, and we have questions in here that ask you to code items J2030A, 2030B, and 2030C. So go ahead and take a few minutes to reacquaint yourself with Mr. J, and then we'll go over the responses in just a moment. And actually go ahead and go all the way through J2040 as well while you're working there at your tables, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started again. So we'll go through now the responses to this case scenario. Hopefully most of you have completed looking at J2030 and J2040. So I'll just ask people like before to just call out answers. So what was your answer for J2030A? Yes, okay. And how about for 2030B? What was the date? 15, okay. And what about J2030C? Great, so you got all of those right, and you found the right things in the case study for this. Okay, let's talk about J2040. So what did you say for J2040A? Skipped it, okay. And what about then the next item and the one after that too? All of them are skipped, that's right. So if that was not what you thought, it is because the 2040A through C items are conditional on the patient having had a positive screen for shortness of breath. Okay, good. So we're going to move on to now section N. This is the medications items. This one addresses the use of bowel regimens for patients who are receiving opioids. And so this section is looking for items or data about the initiation or the continuation of both PRN as well as regularly scheduled opioids and the use of or provision of bowel regimens for patients that are receiving opioids, whether PRN or scheduled or both. And the items in this section are used to calculate the NQF measure 1617. And this is the third and final of the conditional measures in the HIS. So this measure is conditional on a patient receiving an opioid, either PRN or scheduled. So the intent of the items are to determine whether patients who are receiving opioids for any reason, whether scheduled or PRN, are also receiving a bowel regimen, or if they're not receiving a bowel regimen, that it's because of a reason, that there's a particular reason for why a bowel regimen would not be appropriate for that particular patient. Okay. So we'll start here with a little tip. It's kind of analogous to a tip shared earlier in the dyspnea section. Again, here for comfort kits or pre-printed admission orders, those orders alone are not sufficient to consider a treatment initiated, so keep that in mind. The treatment is not considered initiated until the patient or family are instructed to begin the use of the medication or treatment, okay? Let's take a look at the first item in this section, and that's NO500, scheduled opioid. So this item is looking for whether a scheduled opioid was initiated or continued, and if so, the date that it was initiated or continued. So remember that this item is completed based on clinical documentation regarding the first regularly scheduled opioid treatment that was initiated at the hospice. So don't include treatments from a prior care setting unless the hospice has received an order to continue that same treatment, okay? Second item in the section is N0510. This one is about PRN opioids. This one asks about whether a PRN opioid was initiated or continued, and same again, if so, the date that it was initiated or continued. And as with N0500, this item is again completed based on the clinical documentation regarding the first PRN opioid that was initiated at the hospice. So here's a couple of tips about N0500 and N0510. So opioids are used to treat several patient symptoms, including pain and dyspnea. And remember that a patient is likely to develop bowel side effects regardless for what reason the opioid was started, and regardless of whether it's regularly scheduled or PRN. So for items N0500 and N0510, you're going to select code 1 or yes if there's documentation that the patient was taking an opioid for any reason. It's possible, too, that the patient may have received multiple opioids, both PRN and regularly scheduled, possibly on different dates. And remember that when you're completing N0500, you're basing it on the first scheduled opioid. Similarly, with N0510, it's based on the date of the first PRN opioid. So let's look now at the next item in the section. This is N0520, the bowel regimen item. And one thing I want to point out right now here is that you're only going to complete this item, and it says it right there at the top, you're only going to complete this item if N0500A or N0510A were answered as 1 yes. Okay, so in other words, if the patient is receiving regularly scheduled and or PRN opioids, okay? So this means that if there's no documentation that the patient's receiving PRN or a regularly scheduled opioid, you're not going to complete N0520. It's true that patients may receive bowel regimens. I'm seeing the confused looks. there are definitely reasons patients may be receiving a bowel regimen that don't have anything to do with them taking an opioid. The measure, and therefore the items in the HIS, is only looking for bowel regimens that were initiated for patients because they're taking opioids. Okay, that's what the measure is concerned with. Okay, so NO520 then is looking for evidence that a bowel regimen was initiated or continued for patients who are receiving opioids. And then NO520B is where you record the date that you find the care was initiated or continued. For NO520A, there are multiple response options, and actually I'm going to just go back real quick here. You're going to select 0 or no if you don't find any documentation that a bowel regimen was initiated or continued. You're going to select 1, no, but there's documentation of why a bowel regimen was not initiated or continued. If you find no clinical record documentation that a bowel regimen was initiated or continued, and you do find documentation as to why it was not initiated or continued. And we're going to get into more details about why this scenario might happen in just a couple of minutes, okay? And then you would select 2 or yes if the clinical record indicates and includes documentation that a bowel regimen was initiated or continued. Let's talk about a couple of tips here. A bowel regimen may include all of the things that are on this list as well as others, and there's more details about this in your manual. So if you find orders or documentation that any of these kinds of bowel regimens were initiated, then you would select code 2 or yes for NO520A. And then here's a tip about non-pharmacologic bowel regimens. In circumstances, and this sometimes happens, you might not find an order for a non-pharmacologic bowel regimen. If that is the case, then you would use the date that you find documentation that the hospice nurse or clinician instructed the patient or family about non-pharmacologic interventions. And then here's another tip. This one is about selecting the code 1, no, but there's documentation about why the patient is not receiving a bowel regimen. So again, like I said earlier, there are times where a bowel regimen is actually clinically contraindicated. It would not be appropriate care to provide a bowel regimen. So when that is the case, and that could be even if they're taking opioids, there may be good reasons why you're not starting a bowel regimen. So you might find documentation in the clinical record about potential contraindications. Those include things like bowel obstruction or ileus, diarrhea, a colostomy or ileostomy, et cetera. There's several others that are also listed in your HIS manual. So if that's the case, there you would have a situation where you would find potentially the documentation of why a bowel regimen would not be appropriate. There's also potentially times where you might offer the patient a bowel regimen, you might suggest it, they have some particular reason why they don't want to take it, they don't think for whatever reason that they want to take it, so they're refusing the bowel regimen. So if you find clinical documentation that, there is an actual contraindication or patient refusal of a bowel regimen, then you would select no, code 1, no, but there is documentation of why that bowel regimen is not appropriate or was not initiated or continued for this patient. I want to make clear, too, that the quality measure, the NQF 1617 measure, you will get credit for that measure by selecting either code 1 or 2. Because in the scenario, for example, where there's a contraindication for the bowel regimen, the appropriate clinical care is captured by the measure, right? It captures that you appropriately did not initiate a bowel regimen for a patient for whom it would be contraindicated. Okay. Okay, so we're going to practice a little bit here in section N. So take some time to go through and code all of the items in section N now, and we'll reconvene in a few minutes. Okay, so let's go ahead and restart. I'm going to have to talk a little louder for the webcast. I hope this is better. Let me know if not. Okay, let's take a look at what your coding was for N0500A. What did you all put there? Yes, okay. And what about the date? The 15th, okay. And what about for N0510A? Yes, and the date? 15th. And N0520A? Yes, and the date? Also the 15th, that's right. Okay, great. All right. I'm going to forward through here, and then we're going to cover the last section here. So we've covered at this point now, we're shifting gears, get ready. We've covered all the individual items and also all of the individual component measures that make up the new composite measure. So you'll remember and dust off your knowledge from Alexis this morning that the composite measure is made up of component measures, the 7 quality measures that are currently collected by the hospice item set, okay? So we've gone through and we've looked at each of those component measures now, and we've done some case studies involving those measures. And now we're going to shift gears and we're going to turn our attention to how those component measures get used to create the composite measure, okay? So again, the composite measure is made up of 7 component measures. Some of those measures for the third C are also conditional measures, and we're going to talk about how that conditional business fits in with the composite measure now, okay? So basically, the composite measure, again, is looking at, we're going to put this into sort of the case study now. We're thinking about Mr. J's care, okay? So the hospice is going to get credit for the composite quality measure if it provided all of the appropriate care for Mr. J that he should have received on, as measured by those 7 quality measures that we've just reviewed, the pain screening and treatment, the dyspnea screening, pain screening and assessment, dyspnea screening and treatment, the bowels regimens for patients with opioid, and the 2 preferences measures, okay? So we're going to look now at how the hospice taking care of Mr. J would have scored on the composite measure. That's what we'll do going forward. Okay, so you're going to remember that the denominator for this measure includes all patient stays except for those that meet a criteria for exclusion, and Alexis covered that earlier on slide 22 of her presentation. So those that listed the exclusion criteria. So to be counted in the numerator for the composite measure, a patient's stay from the denominator needs to meet the numerator criteria for each of the individual component quality measures, all 7, okay, for which that patient is eligible and should have received care. So let's think about Mr. J's care here. That we've been reading that case study. You've turned to it several times now. So let's think about how the care that he received would contribute to the hospice's overall score on the quality measure here, the composite measure. So that overall score would be based on the care that he received for all those 7 aspects, those other 7 component measures. And it's not only Mr. J's care that we're concerned about. We are concerned about the care that all of the patients at the hospice received for the quality measure, for the composite measure. So to do well on the composite measure, the hospice needs to get as many patients as possible into the numerator, right? This means they have to provide care that gets them credit for each of the component quality measures. And in the next couple of slides, we're going to review what those numerator criteria are and how you would get your patients into the numerator for the composite measure. So again, the main components of the numerator criteria for each of the 7 individual component measures are used to constitute the comprehensive assessment composite measure. So as Alexis explained earlier, the individual measures, right, like the pain screening, asks about whether X was provided or the patient received X care, right? The composite measure is looking at, did the patient receive X, Y, and Z, right? All aspects of care that they should have received, okay? So we're going to go through each of those 7 measures now, and we'll take a look at then how those get combined into a composite measure. So on this slide, you're going to see the first 2 of the individual component quality measures that make up the composite measure. And again, the hospice has to meet the requirements for both of these, in addition to all the other 5, to be getting credit essentially for the composite measure. So you'll remember here that the numerator criteria for these 2 first quality measures about treatment preferences require that the hospice discusses or attempts to discuss the patient's preferences for treatment and their preferences regarding spiritual or existential concerns and care. In addition, to score well on the composite measure, the hospice would also have to have screened the patient for pain. And in addition to that, the patient's stay would have to meet the requirements for the pain assessment quality measure. This quality measure, you'll remember, reflects whether a comprehensive pain assessment was completed. And remember that to count for the measure, a comprehensive pain assessment must include how many characters? 5, okay? So for the hospice to get credit for this one, it also requires them to get into the numerator. They're gonna have to have met that requirement for that comprehensive pain assessment, that at least 5 characteristics of pain were assessed. So, and again, this was a conditional quality measure. So you remember that in the conditional quality measure, if a patient didn't screen positive for pain, you would not be completing a comprehensive assessment assessing 5 out of 7 at least characteristics of pain, right? If they don't have pain, you wouldn't go do a comprehensive pain assessment. So that would be appropriate care, right? Same thing with the dyspnea treatment measure, and we'll get to that in just a second, okay? And in fact, right now, this is the second conditional quality measure that is part of the composite. So again here, to get into the numerator for the composite measure, you would need to both screen the patient for dyspnea and initiate treatment if there was a positive screening, okay? So here, again, it's conditional. You wouldn't start dyspnea treatment unless the patient, in fact, screened positive had the symptom of dyspnea. The composite measure would essentially give the hospice credit for providing the correct clinical care. And in this case, the correct clinical care is not to initiate oxygen for someone who doesn't have shortness of breath. Does that make sense? So the composite measure includes the appropriate set of conditional measures in the numerator automatically, accounting for the appropriate conditional situations that occur with 3 of the measures: the pain measure, the dyspnea measure, and the bowel measure, okay? So the 7th measure, again, was the bowel regimen for patients with opioids we just finished reviewing. So here, again, the numerator of the composite measure would include patient stays where a bowel regimen was initiated or continued for patients who were receiving opioids, okay? So now that we've reviewed what goes into the conditional measure, and we've also reviewed the details of each of the individual component measures, and you're very familiar with Mr. J's care at this point, we're going to ask you to do a polling question, and you'll remember you have a clicker on your table. So the question is whether there is sufficient documentation of all 7 care processes for the hospice to have scored well on the new measure. Okay, so take a review of Mr. J's care. For Mr. J, would they have done well on this composite measure? Okay, so hopefully you've all submitted some answers. And you were correct. The answer is no. Does anybody want to tell us why? Because the pain, that's right. So the comprehensive pain assessment did not include assessing for at least 5 out of 7 characteristics, right? So the hospice would not have received credit for that particular quality measure. And in the composite, if you didn't do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all 7 things, you don't make the numerator for that measure. So doing the wrong thing or not meeting the eligibility, the criteria for one of the component measures will take you out of the composite measure. So again, the hospice needs to do, needs to meet all of the requirements for all 7 quality measures in order for that patient stay to be included in the numerator of the composite measure. Okay. All right, so with that, we wrap up all of the HIS sections for the component measures as well as the explanation of the new composite measure. And at this point, I'm going to be turning it over to Jen Frank, who will take us into the next section. Thank you.
I'm Jennifer Frank, and in this portion of the training, we'll go over the new items that are related to the hospice visits when death is imminent measure pair. So, the new hospice visits when death is imminent quality measure pair was proposed and finalized in the fiscal year 2017 hospice rule. The measure pair assesses hospice staff visits to patients and caregivers at the end of life, and it's specified as a set of 2 measures. We'll review both of those measures in the coming slides. These 2 measures are intended to be interpreted as a set. Both measures in the pair will be calculated using items that are included on the HIS-Discharge of the HIS version 2. Hospice providers will begin collecting that data for this measure for patient discharges that occur on or after April 1st of 2017. The hospice visits when death is imminent measure pair is intended to capture whether the needs of hospice patients and their families were addressed by the hospice staff during their final days. This is the time when patients and caregivers typically experience a higher symptom burden and caregiving burden, and therefore there's often an increased need for care during this time. The 2 measures look at visits from 2 different sets of disciplines. By grouping visits from multiple different disciplines together into each measure, the measures provide hospices with the flexibility to determine which of those visits are most appropriate to meet the patient's and family's needs. What this means is that hospices do not have to provide a visit from any one specific discipline in order to perform well on the measure pair. The items used to calculate this measure pair are new, and they're contained in a new HIS section, Section O, Service Utilization. Section O is added to the HIS version 2, and it's only on the discharge record. This section is not present on the admission record. There are 4 new items in Section O, 2 items that capture the level of care, and 2 items that capture discipline-specific visit information. Each level of care item is paired with a visits item. So each of those pairs asks for the same type of information to be collected during 2 different time frames. So this table presents the 4 new items in Section O. The first row here presents the 2 level of care items. Item O5000 collects the level of care in the final 3 days of life, and item O5020 collects the level of care during the final 7 days. These items are used to determine exclusions for the measure pair, and they are gateway questions before the visits items. The bottom row here shows the 2 visits items. These capture visit information for various disciplines. O5010 collects the number of hospice visits in the final 3 days, and O5030 collects the number of hospice visits in the 3 to 6 days prior to death. This visit information is used to determine whether a stay is included in the numerator of each of these measures. As you can see, O5000 and O5010 both focus on the final 3 days of life, while O5020 and O5030 extend back through the final week of life. So, as I said, the 2 pairs of items capture similar information, but over different timelines. We recognize that, especially without presenting the items yet, this way that they relate to each other is a bit complex, and it can seem like a lot of information at first. But I think the examples that we go through will help a lot. So after we've done the polling questions and case scenarios, all of this will be much clearer. Remember that these items are only captured in the HIS-Discharge record, so it's only collected for patients who are discharged. Additionally, Section O should only be completed for patients who are discharged due to death. So the reason for discharge is recorded in item A2115, and that reason should be 1 expired. If the reason for discharge is anything other than expired, you won't need to complete Section O. This slide portrays the numerator and denominator for the first measure in this measure pair. That's hospice, this is a measure of whether patients received at least 1 visit from selected disciplines in the last 3 days of life. The denominator here is all patient stays, except for those who meet any of the exclusion criteria, and I'll go over those exclusion criteria on the next slide. And the numerator is all of the patients in the denominator who received at least 1 visit from a registered nurse, physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant during the last 3 days of life. Note that they do not have to receive 1 visit from each of these disciplines. Rather, they can get 1 visit from any one of the disciplines in order to be included in the numerator. So to be included in the denominator of this measure, 3 conditions must be met. First, there must be a complete record of the patient's stay, both an HIS admission record and an HIS discharge record. If the stay is missing the admission HIS record, then the stay will be excluded. And if the stay is still active, so the patient has not been discharged, then that stay is also excluded. Second, as we already reviewed, only patients who die at the end of their hospice stay are included in this measure. This is determined by the reason for discharge. If the reason for discharge is anything other than expired, then that stay is excluded from this measure. Finally, patients who received any continuous home care, general inpatient care, or respite care during those last 3 days of life are not included in this measure. What that means is that the measure only includes patients who received routine home care and not the other 3 levels of care during the final 3 days of life. This measure assesses the percentage of patients who received at least one visit from a registered nurse, physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant in the last 3 days of life. Measure 2, the other measure in this measure pair, I'll keep calling them measure 1 and measure 2, covers a different set of disciplines. The reason that the two measures use different sets of disciplines is that each measure is intended to capture a different aspect of care. So this first measure addresses case management and clinical care during the active dying phase. Now we'll go over the two items that capture information for the first measure. This is the first item in section O, it's O5000, level of care in final 3 days. The item asks, did the patient receive continuous home care, general inpatient care, or respite care during the final 3 days of life? If the patient did not receive any of these 3 levels of care during the final 3 days and only received routine home care from the hospice during that time, then the answer is no. If the patient did receive care at those levels during the final 3 days, you would answer this yes. Remember I said earlier that the level of care items are used to determine inclusion or exclusion in the measure. And so because of that, there is a skip pattern here that I want to point out. If the answer is yes, the patient received one of these 3 levels of care, then you would skip the rest of section O and go straight to Z0400, signatures of persons completing the record. So what that means is the remainder of section O is only completed for patients who received routine home care and not CHC, GIP, or respite care during those final 3 days of life. No visit information is reported for patients who received CHC, GIP, or respite care during this time. And that's because those patients are excluded from the measure. Okay, now I'll go over some tips for completing item O5000, level of care in final 3 days. This item captures, of course, the level of care during the final 3 days of life. Those days are the day of death, the day before death, and the day that's 2 days prior to the date of death. If the patient was on hospice for fewer than 3 days, you should select a response based on the days when the patient received hospice care or was enrolled in hospice. So for example, if the patient was only enrolled for 1 day, you would still answer item O5000, and you would answer it based on the level of care for that 1 day. As we continue through section O, I'll keep describing how to answer these items for patients with a short length of stay. The 4 levels of hospice care are defined in the Medicare Hospice Conditions of Participation. And so to complete this item for patients who are not Medicare or Medicaid patients, you should still use those definitions for the 4 levels of care that are in the Medicare Hospice Conditions of Participation. So the next item is O5010, number of hospice visits in the final 3 days. And remember the skip pattern from the previous item. You will move on to this item, O5010, if you answered no to item O5000, level of care in the final 3 days. So the patient only received routine home care from the hospice during that time. And then once again, if you answered yes, the patient received CHC, GIP, or respite, then you would not complete this item, number of visits. So in this item, O5010, you'll enter the number of visits provided by hospice staff from the indicated discipline on each of the dates indicated. The dates in this item are the day of death, 1 day prior to death, and 2 days prior to death. These days are shown in the 3 columns that are on the right, and note that they're listed in reverse chronological order, so the day of death is listed in that first column, followed by the day before that, and so on. The disciplines to record visits for are shown in rows A through F. Those are nurse, physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, medical social worker, chaplain or spiritual counselor, licensed practical nurse, and aide. Okay, once again, for each row, A through F, you'll enter the number of visits provided by the indicated discipline on that day. For each cell, you'll just enter one character, 0 through 9, to indicate the number of visits provided by that discipline on that day. If there were more than 9 visits from a given discipline on a given day, you should just enter a 9 in that cell. Do not leave cells blank unless you are directed to by the skip patterns. And if there were no visits from a discipline on a given day, you would enter a 0 in that cell. I want to point out again that Section O is only completed for patients who are discharged due to death. So the day of death should match the discharge date that is listed in item A0270. The date 1 day prior to death then could be calculated as A270 minus 1. The day 2 days prior to death is A270 minus 2. And we have that sort of noted within the item itself. I also want to take a moment to address high and low numbers of visits in this item. As we've been over, if the patient did not receive a visit on a given day, you would enter, or from a given discipline on a given day, you would enter a 0 in that cell. And a 0 is not necessarily a bad outcome because maybe the patient just didn't need a visit from that discipline. And I want to remind you that this measure looks at whether the patient received at least 1 visit from selected disciplines. So a patient who received an RN visit on 1 day would be counted in the measure numerator the same as a patient who received an RN visit every day. We also recognize that some patients may decline services and that rapid and unanticipated patient declines do occur. And because of this, scores of 100% are not the expectation for this measure pair. Again, if the patient received more than 9 visits on from a given discipline on a given day, you'll enter a 9 in that cell. We expect that this will be rare to have so many visits from one discipline in 1 day. And we do understand that a 9 could mean 9 or more when we're looking at this. I also want to remind you that once the conditions for inclusion in the numerator are met, in this case, at least 1 clinical visit, a greater number of visits, like 10 compared to 9, would not change the hospice's performance on the measure. Okay, a note about zeros. There are multiple situations where you might enter a 0 in a cell. If the patient was not enrolled in hospice on one of these days, then a 0 in the cells of that column would indicate that the patient was not enrolled in hospice on that date. For example, if a patient was only on hospice for 2 days, the day before death and the day of death, then the final column for visits 2 days prior to death would be all 0s. For days that the patient was enrolled in hospice, a 0 entered in cells for that day would indicate that the patient did not receive a visit from that discipline on that day. So the tips on this slide relate to what visits may be counted in the item. Visits can be counted from hospice staff members who are either employees, contractors, or affiliates, or who provide unpaid services. To review the disciplines again, those are registered nurse, physician, or nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, medical social worker, chaplain or spiritual counselor, and aide. Visits that are provided to the patient's family from these disciplines can be counted in this item. Phone calls are not counted. And finally, post-mortem visits are not counted in this item because the measure is intended to address case management and clinical care. Okay, so this brings us to our first Section O polling question. Can the visits from a volunteer made to Mr. Joseph be counted in item O5010, number of hospice visits in the final 3 days? So I'll give you a second to put your responses in. Okay. So, everyone said B, no, and that's correct. Visits from volunteers who are not acting as one of the specified disciplines are not counted in this item. As I described on the previous slide, visits from unpaid staff members are counted if they are working as one of the specified disciplines. One example of this might be a chaplain who is unpaid but provides chaplain visits to patients for the hospice. Okay, so now we'll move on to the second measure in the measure pair, hospice visits when death is imminent. This measure looks at whether patients receive at least 2 visits from selected disciplines in the last 7 days of life. The denominator is all patient stays except for those who meet any of the exclusion criteria, which I'll go over on the next slide. And the numerator is all patients who received at least 2 visits from medical social worker, chaplain or spiritual counselor, licensed practical nurse, or hospice aide during the last 7 days of life. I want to note that the last 7 days of life are inclusive of the final 3 days of life, which are part of the first measure as well. Note that the patient does not have to receive 2 visits from each of the disciplines in this measure, but 2 visits total from the group of disciplines. That could mean 2 visits from the same discipline or from 2 different disciplines. The exclusion criteria for this measure are similar to the first measure in this measure pair, but they're not exactly the same. To be included in the denominator of this measure, 4 conditions must be met. First, the same as the first measure, there must be a complete record of the stay, consisting of both an HIS admission record and an HIS-Discharge record. If the stay is missing the HIS admission record, then the stay is excluded. If the stay is active, so the patient has not yet been discharged, that stay is also excluded. Second, the same as the first measure, only patients who die in hospice care are included in this measure. If the reason for discharge is anything other than expired, then the stay is excluded from the denominator. Third, patients who received any continuous home care, general inpatient care, or respite care during the last 7 days of life are not included in the measure. This measure only includes patients who received routine home care during that time period and not the other 3 levels of care. This is similar to the first measure, except that it's for 7 days instead of 3 days. Finally, patients with a very short length of stay are excluded. If the length of stay was only 1 day, as indicated by the admission date and the discharge date, then the stay is excluded. This is because it may be difficult or inappropriate for hospices to provide multiple visits of this type to patients receiving only 1 day of hospice care. Okay. As I described earlier, the disciplines included in this measure are different from those that are included in the first measure. Here we include visits from medical social workers, chaplains or spiritual counselors, licensed practical nurses, and aides. The range of disciplines included in this measure gives providers flexibility to provide individualized care to each patient that is in line with the patient and family's preferences and goals of care. The time frame is longer in order to capture both the active dying phase and the transition period before. The 2 visits, once again, may be from 2 different disciplines or could both be from the same discipline. This is item O5020, level of care in final 7 days. The item asks, did the patient receive continuous home care, general inpatient care, or respite care during any of the final 7 days of life? This item is very similar to item O5000, level of care in final 3 days, except that the time frame is 7 days instead of 3. So you'll answer the question in the same way, just for a different time period. If the patient did not receive any of these 3 levels of care during those 7 days, then you will, and only received routine home care during that time, you will answer 0, no. If the patient did receive any of these 3 levels of care during that time, the answer would be yes. And the skip pattern is also similar to the earlier item. If the answer is yes, that the patient received one of these 3 levels of care, you're instructed to skip the rest of section O and go to Z400, signatures of persons completing the record. No further visit information is reported for patients who received any CHC, GIP, or respite care during that time. So this slide reiterates what I presented on the previous slide. Again, O5020 is different from the prior level of care item in its time frame. It asks about the final 7 days rather than the final 3. Now I'll go over some tips for completing this item. If the patient was on hospice for fewer than 7 days, you should select a response based on the days when the patient was on hospice. So for example, if the patient was on hospice for only 4 days, you would answer O5020 based on the level of care during those 4 days. Similar to item O5000, level of care in final 3 days, for patients who are not Medicare or Medicaid patients, hospices should still apply the definitions of the 4 levels of care from the Medicare hospice conditions of participation. This is item O5030, number of hospice visits in the 3 to 6 days prior to death. In this item, you'll enter the number of visits provided by hospice staff from each of the indicated disciplines on each of the dates indicated. The rows here, A through F, show the same disciplines that are listed in O5010. Those are registered nurse, physician or nurse practitioner or physician assistant, medical social worker, chaplain or spiritual counselor, licensed practical nurse, and aide. The difference from item O5010 is that the columns show a different set of days. There are 4 days in this item from the day 3 days prior to death through the day 6 days prior to death. For rows A through F, you'll enter the number of visits provided by each discipline on each day. O5020 and O5030 are focused on the final 7 days, but since the information about visits during the final 3 days was already reported in item O5010, this item only includes the remaining 4 days in that week. Again, a note about calculating the dates. Since the day of death is the same as the discharge date provided in A270, you can calculate the dates used in this item based on the date in A270. So the day 3 days prior to death is A270 minus 3, the day 4 days prior to death is A270 minus 4, and so on. The tips on this slide and the next are the same as what I described for item A5010, number of hospice visits in final 3 days. For each cell in O5030, use one character, 0 through 9, to indicate the number of visits provided by each discipline on a given day. Do not leave cells blank unless you are directed to by the skip patterns. And if there are more than 9 visits from a given discipline on a given day, enter a 9 in that cell. Again, if there were no visits from a given discipline on a given day, enter a 0 in that cell. These zeros may represent one of 2 situations. If the patient was not enrolled in hospice on that date, then a 0 in the cells of that column indicate that the patient was not enrolled. If the patient was enrolled in hospice on that day, then a 0 in that cell indicates the patient did not receive visits from that discipline on that day. Individuals whose visits can be counted in this item include hospice staff members in each of the listed disciplines who are either employees, contractors, and affiliates, or who provide unpaid services. Same as item 5010, visits provided to the patient's family may be counted in this item, and phone calls cannot be counted. So this brings us to our second polling question about section O. Which of the following 4 situations is not captured in items O5010 or O5030? I'll read these out. A medical social worker making a joint visit with a hospice nurse. B, a retired RN who is a hospice volunteer providing companionship to patients and family members. C, a spiritual counselor who is part of the hospice interdisciplinary group but not paid for his work. Or D, a nurse practitioner whose services are contracted through an agency. So which of these is not counted? Okay. Great. Correct answer is B, a retired RN who is a hospice volunteer providing companionship to patients and family members. This visit is not counted in the items because it is a volunteer visit. Despite the fact that he or she is a retired RN, they are acting as a volunteer in this situation and not providing a clinical nursing visit. Okay. So now we'll do a case scenario for hospice visits when death is imminent in order to practice the items in Section O on the HIS-Discharge. For this activity, please review Part 2 of Mr. Joseph's case study. Part 2 of the case study is located in your participant folders and is available in the materials for online participants. This document includes selected excerpts from the nurse's notes as well as a calendar of visits. You will need to review both the excerpts and the calendar in order to get the full picture of Mr. Joseph's care and to complete these items. Please also keep in mind the criteria for completing the section and these items. So it will be helpful to work through the case in a stepwise manner, first determining whether Mr. Joseph died and when, then determining his level of care, and then the visits he received. Please also note that there was an error in labeling the items on some of the materials. For everyone in the room, it's been corrected. For everyone in the room, you're fine. For everyone online, the materials should be correct now, and I'll just say that for items O5010 and O5030, the sub-items should read A through G, F, A through F, not G through L. A through F makes sense and is correct. So that's the only change, and it should be correct everywhere now. So please work in groups to complete Section O for Mr. Joseph. We'll spend about 10 minutes on this activity, and we'll monitor the room and respond to questions. There's also an HIS table or manual on each table for your reference if you need it. Okay, I think we'll get started going through this in a moment. Just let you wrap up conversations in the room. Okay. So as you worked through the case study, the first question was O5000, level of care in the final 3 days. So how did you answer this question? Did the patient receive continuous home care, general inpatient care, or respite care during any of the final 3 days of life? I'll let you put your polling questions in. Okay. So most people said A, no, and that's correct. Mr. Joseph received routine home care during this time. There is not any indication that he moved into general inpatient care or respite care, or that he received the 8 hours of care of visits that would be a part of a continuous home care stay. Trying to move forward. Oh, there we go. Okay. So next, we'll go through the answers to O5010, the number of hospice visits in the final 3 days. And we'll go through this column by column, starting with visits on the day of death. So first, to make sure we're all on the same page, could someone call out the date of Mr. Joseph's death? Great. Okay, I heard a lot of the 29th, and that's correct. It's November 29th. You can see that described in the excerpted case notes. The calendar provided on the last page of this also lists a visit on the 30th, the day following death, from a medical social worker. This post-death visit is not counted in item O5010, and of course that date is not one of the dates that's listed in the item. Okay, so how many visits total did you record in this item for Mr. Joseph on his day of death? Great, I heard a lot of ones. In this item, we record one visit on the day of death, and that's from the aide who arrived in the morning. This visit is noted with a 1 in the column, in the first column of row F. The scenario also describes a visit from an RN on the day of death. However, the notes on this make it clear that that visit occurred after the time of Mr. Joseph's death. Since the visit was post-mortem, it is not counted in this item. As a reminder, you'll fill in zeros for all of the other cells in that column. If there was not a visit from that discipline, it should be a 0 and not a blank. And so how many visits did you record in this item for 1 day prior to death? Okay, I hear 3, and that's correct. There are 3 visits for Mr. Joseph 1 day prior to death. That's Monday, November 28th in the calendar that was provided in that case. The registered nurse and medical social worker visited at the same time. Even though the visits occurred at the same time, it is recorded as a visit from each of those disciplines. So you'll have a 1 in rows A and C for this second column. You also may have noted in the excerpted notes that the social worker stayed longer to meet with the family. As a reminder, visits like this to support caregivers are counted in the item. The aide also visited separately, and that's recorded in row F. And how about 2 days prior to death? How many visits did you record there? I hear 1, and that is correct. There was 1 visit 2 days prior to death from the licensed practical nurse. We didn't provide an excerpt from the notes for this day, but you can see in the calendar for Sunday, November 27th, that there was a visit from the LPN on that day. The calendar also shows a volunteer visit. However, volunteer visits are not counted in this item. As we reviewed through the polling questions, visits from unpaid staff members can be counted if they are providing a visit as one of the listed disciplines, but volunteer visits outside of those disciplines would not be counted. Okay, so that completes the first pair of level of care and visits items, and now we'll move on to the next set, which address care in the final week. So how did you answer item O5020, level of care in final 7 days? Did the patient receive CHC, GIP, or respite care during any of the final 7 days of life? I'll let you put your responses in. Okay. The correct answer here is no. Most people answered no. The patient did not receive those levels of care. Mr. Joseph received routine home care during that time. And now we'll cover item O5030, number of hospice visits in the 3 to 6 days prior to death. The previous item said final 7 days. But since we already recorded the visits that Mr. Joseph received in the final 3 days under O5010, there are only these 4 additional days left to record. So how many visits did Mr. Joseph receive on the day 3 days prior to death? That's correct, 1. We record 1 visit for Mr. Joseph 3 days prior to death. That's Sunday, November 26th. According to the calendar, he received a visit from the RN and from a volunteer, and as we reviewed, we don't record volunteer visits, so just a 1 in row A for the registered nurse and zeros in the other rows. How many visits did you record for 4 days prior to death? Oh, I put it up early. You got it right anyway. We record 3 visits on the day 4 days prior to death, which was Friday, November 25th. There was an RN visit, an LPN visit, and an aide visit. And each of these is recorded for the day in rows A, E, and F, with zeros in the other rows. For 5 days prior to death, how many visits did you record? That's correct. Mr. Joseph had 1 visit 5 days prior to death on Thursday, November 24th, and that was from the aide. And finally, how many visits 6 days prior to death? Great. You all did really well on all of these items. So Mr. Joseph had 3 visits 6 days prior to death, That's Wednesday, November 23rd. There were visits from the RN, medical social worker, and aide. These are recorded as ones in rows A, C, and F. So that wraps up this case scenario. I want to make a few reminders about situations that didn't come up in the scenario. Mr. Joseph received at least one visit on every day during that week, but if a patient had not received any visits on a given day, you would have all zeros in that column. You would still fill it in. Additionally, we didn't have to think about phone calls during this exercise, but you'll see in the scenario that earlier in Mr. Joseph's stay, on Tuesday, November 22nd, the calendar listed a phone call from an RN. And I want to note that a phone call would not be included as a visit in this item, because only in-person visits are counted. You can find some additional clinical coding examples for all of the items in Section O in the HIS manual. Those are in Chapter 2, Section O, and the examples are on pages 20-8 through 20-16. They cover all of the items in Section O. And that wraps that up. On the next couple of slides, there are some additional resources about the HIS and these measures, which I won't immediately go over. We have a couple of minutes left, so we'll be able to take some questions. Excuse me. These could be about this visit section or anything that was covered earlier by Francie or Alexis, who may have stepped out of the room. Go ahead.
Quappy question. When you say that the patient expired on 11/29, you had an aide visit, the RN walked in, the RN has to pronounce, so why isn't that counted as a visit? And in the states where an RN cannot pronounce, they're not dead until the doctor says they're dead, the RN's there. Was all that thought of? Or were you just saying, if you think they're dead, you don't get to count your visit?
I do understand how there could be some potentially tricky scenarios. Overall, we're interested in visits that occur prior to death because we're interested in, that case management and clinical care that's happening. So we are not counting those post-death visits because of those reasons. Oh.
When you look at these data, is there any connection between Section O data and the service intensity add-on?
That's a good question. I guess I could see it going a couple different ways. Related to level of care, those level of care items are still, the level of care is defined according to the hospice conditions of participation. So
right.
A patient receiving routine home care who gets the add-on is still a routine home care patient. We expect that we could see an increase in these visits related to the service intensity add-on. It doesn't affect, how you will complete the items, if that's your question.
I guess, is there any correlation between the two? Because you had said the duration of the visit doesn't matter if you stay 3 hours or 1 hour, but with the service intensity add-on, there's a maximum of 4 hours.
So are you asking if that affects how we would define the length of a visit?
I guess I'm just asking if there's a correlation between the two, or were the two completed in isolation?
In terms of design, we I guess took those things into account. We don't know exactly how the visits will be correlated going forward at this time, but we'll continue to look at it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Does any other like home health, home care, have a composite measure built into their quality measure reporting?
That's a good question. I am not sure about the composite measures in other programs.
Because it sounds like this composite measure, by evidence of this example is really going to affect how our quality reporting looks like. So I'm just curious if is hospice the only one that's ever had a composite measure applied? No? Does
I'm
it?
hearing no
Okay,
from the
that's
room,
my
but
question.
I can't speak to that. But
Okay, that's my question. And then, if I might ask another one, and I might have missed it because this was a lot. For the patient on service for less than 3 days, they are included in the denominator regardless? For routine care, they are included?
yes, that's correct. And you would just, fill out the items based on that, 1 or 2 days of care.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I think that I may be out of time, so I will turn it back over.